Get out of my way! We need to
They
move
dismissed
now!
her with "medics
I am
don't
the
fight"
medic here.
until the
You follow
ambush
my
forced her
command.
to lead the counterattack. The desert wind tore across the
Full
training
assault!
range in sharp,
Push
heated
forward!
gusts,
Do
lifting
not
curtains
stop!
of dust
Go,
that clung
go,
to the
go!
armored hulls of 3 idling IFVs. Engines rumbled
to the
like
ridge,
distant
let's go!
thunder,
Cover
the
the
kind
left
that
flank,
vibrates
pushing
through
forward.
boots and
Keep
bone.
moving, don't stop!
Soldiers milled around the formation, gearing up for another live fire
move,
exercise, their
Keep low.
silhouettes wavy in
Push
the
forward.
rising heat. Then the yelling started. A broad-shouldered sergeant stormed across the
Push
sand,
forward.
boots
Weapons
pounding
free
the
on my
ground so
command.
hard the dust rose
Copy
around
that.
each step. His shadow
Moving
fell
up,
over the
stay
woman
sharp.
standing alone near the front line of
Move
medic,
to the ridge. Let's go.
identifiable by the red cross
Covering
patch on her
fire,
arm,
keep moving!
the only one in the entire squad
Almost
wearing
there.
it.
Push
She
forward.
held an M4 against her chest,
New target,
calm and
300
steady,
meters, right
as if the
flank.
weapon belonged
Engage.
there. It only made him
Engaging.
angrier.
Moving
"Put that
up.
rifle down, medic," he roared, voice
Keep
slicing
firing on
through
that
the air with the
position.
force of an artillery
We have
crack.
to move up now! Cover
"Medics
me.
don't fight." Laughter rippled instantly through the ranks. Sharp,
Sierra
mocking,
Bravo 6, this is
relieved
Echo
because
4.
mocking
Move to
someone
waypoint
else
3.
always made a
Copy
brutal
that, Echo
morning a
4.
little easier
All
for them.
teams, push
A
it,
few
move.
soldiers knelt in the sand near a vehicle, rifles
Move up,
half
move up.
raised, smirking
Contact
in her
front.
direction.
Let's go!
One of them elbowed the guy next to him. "Look at her grip. She's gonna drop it the moment recoil hits." "Oh, or shoot her own foot," someone added, drawing another round of laughter. But the medic didn't react. She didn't even glance at them. Instead, she shifted her stance by barely an inch, redistributing the weight of the rifle with practiced precision. Her shoulders relaxed, her elbows tucked in, the muzzle leveled with a quiet certainty that did not match the uniform she wore, nor the job she supposedly belonged to. It was the kind of adjustment no rookie made. Subtle, instinctive, habitual. For a moment, half a second, no more the laughter faltered. Not because anyone respected her, but because something about the motion felt wrong. Wrong in the sense that it didn't belong to someone who didn't fight. Wrong in the sense that a few of them suddenly realized they had no idea who she actually was beneath that medic patch. But the pause vanished as quickly as it came. The sergeant kept yelling. His veins stood out like cords on his neck, his chest heaving as he jabbed a thick finger toward her rifle. "Fall to the back. You are not part of the firing line. You don't get to play soldier today. Your job is bandages and morphine. Stay out of the way." More chuckles. A grunt behind her scoffed loud enough to be heard over the engines. "Should have stayed in the aid station." Another voice. "Hope she doesn't faint when the shooting starts." Dust blew past her boots. The heat shimmered around her. She remained absolutely still. Her eyes lifted only once toward the distant ridge, where the horizon blurred into pale sky. A glance so quick, so clinical, it felt like she was calculating something far more serious than a training drill. Then her gaze dropped back to her rifle, as if confirming a judgment only she understood. She tightened her grip, just slightly, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. One soldier did notice the one kneeling a few meters behind her, circled in your reference image. His amusement faded as he watched the way her hands settled into place, how her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the weapon, not the chaos around her. A small crease formed between his brows, the kind that appears when instinct warns of a detail that doesn't line up. But before he could make sense of it, the sergeant barked again. "Medic," I said, "back of the line." She didn't argue. She didn't resist. She simply lowered the rifle a fraction, as though respecting the command on paper, yet somehow retaining full readiness. The movement was quiet, respectful, and still undeniably wrong for a medic. The squad saw a joke. The sergeant saw disobedience. Only the kneeling soldier saw something else. Experience. The kind you don't learn in schoolhouse training. The kind you only earn with live rounds and real screams in the air. But no one had time to question her further, because in the next few minutes, when the first real shots cracked across the desert and the ambush erupted from the ridge, every mocking voice on that range would choke into silence. And the medic they dismissed a moment ago would be the only one who knew exactly what to do. The medic stepped away from the firing line, with a quiet steadiness that contrasted sharply with the rising noise of the formation, allowing the sergeant's anger to fade behind her like a gust of abrasive wind crossing the hot desert ground. Around her, several soldiers continued trading jokes with the careless confidence of people who had never carried responsibility beyond their own gear, their voices drifting across the sand in mocking waves that blended with the steady rumble of the idling IFVs. One private with a chiseled grin and too much bravado strutted past her with exaggerated swagger, wiping fake tears from his eyes while loudly insisting that the medic must be crushed by all that combat pressure. His friends laughed, eager to amplify the humiliation, while another soldier tapped the Red Cross patch on her sleeve and suggested she return to the aid station before she accidentally elbows someone with that rifle. The medic ignored them completely, adjusting the straps of her standard medical pack with slow, measured motions that revealed a deliberate focus rather than emotional discomfort. The sergeant, still simmering with irritation, strode back toward her with forceful, sand-kicking steps, his jaw clenched as if holding back another string of insults. Without warning, he tossed a heavy trauma rucksack at her feet and ordered her to carry it for the remainder of the drill, speaking loudly enough for nearby soldiers to hear every condescending word. "If you insist on pretending you're part of the line," he barked, "you can start by hauling something that actually matters." More laughter followed, spreading through the squad with the ugly ease of a roomer in a cramped barracks. She knelt calmly, lifted the overloaded pack, and maneuvered the straps over her shoulders with a smooth, practiced technique that minimized strain and protected her lower back. The movement suggested someone trained to preserve energy over long distances rather than someone learning on the fly, yet nothing about her expression hinted at pride or defiance. One corporal noticed the efficiency of her posture and frowned slightly, unsure whether he had witnessed genuine skill or simply good luck, but he stayed silent to avoid contradicting the prevailing mood around them. The sergeant began reorganizing the squad for the next drill, barking orders that scattered the soldiers into staggered positions across the range. Many rushed forward with frantic eagerness, hoping to appear decisive under supervision, but the medic moved more deliberately, scanning the ground for uneven sand and potential tripping hazards while keeping her rifle secured against her chest. Her steps were unhurried yet observant, revealing the situational awareness of someone accustomed to chaotic environments, though the others interpreted her pacing as simple hesitation. As she advanced, a few younger troops attempted to bump her playfully or crowd her path while laughing at their own antics, but she sidestepped each attempt with minimal movement, shifting her weight as if she had rehearsed the pattern countless times. The accuracy of her foot placement unsettled one of them briefly, but he dismissed it as coincidence, choosing humor over the possibility that she possessed skills they did not understand. When the sergeant ordered everyone into kneeling positions, the medic lowered herself without hesitation, keeping her gear stable and rifle angled safely downward with correct muzzle discipline. The soldiers beside her watched closely, expecting a fumble or misalignment, but instead she completed a quick scan of her pack, adjusting its center of mass to prevent it from shifting during movement. To the untrained eye, her motions looked like simple practicality, but the kneeling soldier behind her recognized hints of efficient gear management rarely seen among medics. He studied her hands as they brushed lightly across the rifle's controls, noting how her fingers checked the magazine seating and forward assist with casual familiarity rather than nervous uncertainty. It wasn't the fluid mastery of an elite operator, yet it was undeniably too confident for someone whose specialty supposedly revolved around bandages and stabilizing wounded personnel. His eyebrows tightened, not because she seemed dangerous, but because she clearly wasn't the fragile liability everyone assumed. Further down the line, another group of soldiers began chanting, "Medic, medic, medic," with exaggerated rhythm, their tones somewhere between taunting and bored. The medic ignored the noise entirely, focusing instead on the distant ridge, where heat shimmered across a thin layer of dust drifting above the rocks. Her breathing steadied, syncing with the slight rise and fall of the horizon, as though she was calibrating her awareness to the environment rather than the people beside her. The ridicule persisted. Dust flicked at her boots, sarcastic comments about her supposed fragility, offhand remarks about how she would collapse the moment the drill intensified, but none of it penetrated her composure. She remained anchored, her silence forming a stable center in the middle of their restless immaturity, her focus drifting repeatedly toward the same section of the ridge with a concentration that did not match the casual rhythm of a training exercise. Only the kneeling soldier behind her noticed the way her posture shifted subtly, the way her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly when the wind shifted direction, carrying faint echoes from beyond the ridge rather than across the flat range. She wasn't sensing danger through intuition. She was observing environmental cues, dust rising at the wrong cadence, a reflection that didn't belong to sunlight, or a sound carried on the wind that broke the natural pattern of the landscape. The others remained oblivious, still trapped in their own amusement, while the sergeant continued shouting preparations for the next phase with growing impatience. Yet the medic, still kneeling in the hot sand with a trauma pack digging into her shoulders, waited with a quiet vigilance that suggested far more experience than anyone around her realized. Something was wrong on that ridge, and she was the only one who recognized it. The medic kept her eyes locked on the distant ridge, studying the uneven shimmer with a quiet intensity that suggested she was tracking something far more deliberate than the drifting heat, while the rest of the squad continued shifting and muttering in careless ignorance of the danger settling over the range like an invisible weight. She inhaled slowly, trying to isolate the faint metallic vibration riding the breeze, recognizing the unnatural rhythm with a familiarity she had hoped never to experience again. Yet she offered no visible sign that her nerves had tightened beneath her calm exterior. The sergeant barked another string of commands, waving his arm in harsh, sweeping motions that pushed soldiers into a loose, staggered formation, facing the wrong direction for what was coming, though none of them seemed aware enough to question the inconsistency. They scrambled clumsily across the sand, kicking up thick bursts of dust as they adjusted their stances with forced bravado, entirely convinced that the only threat they faced was the sergeant's temper, rather than anything lurking beyond the ridge. A cluster of younger troops noticed the medic's shifting attention and broke into low, mocking laughs, assuming she was rattled or overwhelmed, rather than quietly analyzing terrain features with practiced precision. One bumped his friend's shoulder and muttered something about medic nerves, drawing a few grins from soldiers who had no idea how close they stood to something far more serious than a training scenario. The medic paused mid-breath when the wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable sound of metal sliding against metal, too controlled to be erosion, too crisp to be wildlife, and entirely wrong for this hour of the day. She lowered her chin slightly, angling her helmet to reduce glare, while narrowing her field of vision to the portion of the ridge where the shimmer bent in a pattern that did not match natural desert heat, her focus tightening with growing certainty. Nearby soldiers adjusted weapons and gear, completely unaware of the incoming threat, their movements sloppy and unfocused as they waited for the sergeant's next command with a mixture of boredom and irritation. One soldier struggled with his sling, while another lifted his rifle in a half-hearted attempt to appear attentive, leaving openings in the formation that would prove disastrous within seconds, though none of them possessed the awareness to recognize the danger. The medic shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, grounding her boots more firmly into the sand while preparing for movement in a way that indicated training beyond standard medical instruction, and the kneeling soldier behind her noticed the subtle change with a puzzled frown. He watched her posture tighten with controlled readiness, sensing that something was wrong even though he lacked the context to understand why her behavior had shifted so sharply from passive compliance to focused vigilance. Then the flash revealed itself, a brief, razor-thin streak of reflected metal emerging between two rocks before disappearing as quickly as it came, yet unmistakable to anyone who had once searched for the telltale signs of an elevated firing position. The medic exhaled sharply, her decision made in the space between heartbeats, and her voice left her throat in a low, steady warning that was drowned instantly by the sound arriving on its heels. The first shot cracked through the air like a whip, its terrifying precision slicing across the range before slamming into the nearest IFV with a metallic scream that sent sparks spraying across its armor. Soldiers jerked instinctively downward but reacted too slowly, many still half standing as confusion rippled across their faces like a wave striking stone. A second shot followed immediately, punching into the sand inches from a soldier's leg and throwing him backward with a panicked cry as grains exploded into the air. Chaos ignited instantly. "Get down," the sergeant bellowed, though his voice cracked under the pressure, revealing a fear he hadn't anticipated facing during what he believed would be a controlled training exercise. His commands collided with the rising shouts of panicked troops who dove for cover without coordination, some tripping over loose sand while others sprinted blindly toward the vehicles, creating dangerous choke points that left several exposed in open terrain. The medic moved with immediate intent, grabbing the shoulder of the nearest soldier and forcing him flat before another round sliced through the space where his head had been a moment earlier. Her voice cut through the spiraling noise with crisp clarity, ordering him toward the IFV's hull with a sharp urgency that demanded obedience rather than negotiation. She crawled low, keeping her profile tight and her gear compact, demonstrating the instincts of someone who had survived ambushes before, though she never paused to acknowledge the memory. More rounds hammered the ground and vehicles, spraying dust, sand, and shards of metal into the air, while soldiers scrambled for safety, with the frantic desperation of people realizing they were utterly unprepared for a real engagement. The sergeant attempted to regain control, yelling conflicting orders that only deepened the confusion, his authority crumbling under the pressure of coordinating a squad with no battle continuity. The medic slipped behind a concrete barrier barely tall enough to cover her shoulders, lifting her rifle into a ready position with quick, efficient movements that reflected practical training rather than cinematic heroism. The kneeling soldier finally reached her side, chest heaving and eyes wide, realizing with dawning clarity that she had recognized the ambush long before the first shot landed. Dust swirled around them as another volley erupted from the ridge, the rounds landing with terrifying accuracy that pinned the squad in place. The line was broken, the formation was useless, and the sergeant no longer had control. Yet the medic, steady beneath the storm of fire, had already begun turning panic into direction through pure, disciplined action. Because she wasn't just reacting, she had been preparing since the moment the wind shifted. The medic pressed her back against the chipped concrete barrier, letting the chaos settle into a rhythm she could interpret, measuring each burst of gunfire with the steady breathing of someone who had learned long ago that panic only sharpened an enemy's aim. She kept her helmet angled low to reduce glare while maintaining just enough peripheral vision to track the soldiers nearest her, noting which ones were responsive, which were frozen, and which were simply overwhelmed by the violent shift from training drill to live engagement. Rounds tore into the sand with brutal intensity, forcing a cluster of troops into haphazard positions that left several dangerously exposed, their rifles clutched in stiff hands that betrayed a mix of fear and inexperience. The sergeant attempted to regain control, shouting orders that overlapped, contradicted, and stumbled over one another, but the tremor in his voice undermined any authority his rank demanded, leaving the squad without a cohesive anchor in the storm. The medic recognized the fracture in leadership instantly, though she offered no overt challenge to the sergeant, understanding that survival depended more on steady momentum than on formal hierarchy. She slid closer to the nearest soldier, a young private pressed flat against the sand with his eyes darting wildly, and placed a firm hand on his shoulder plate, grounding him with a touch that carried more certainty than anything he had heard since the ambush began. "Keep your silhouette low and your breathing slower," she told him, her voice level enough to cut through the chaos without rising above it. "Follow my movement, not the noise. You're all right." Her words reached him in a place deeper than logic, and his frantic inhalations softened into something manageable, allowing him to shift behind the barrier with a steadier grip on his rifle. The next burst slammed into the side of the nearest IFV, rattling the metal with a sharp clang that sent a ripple of fear through the soldiers crouched beside it. The medic used the brief pause between volleys to scan the terrain again, focusing on the exposed dirt rise where two soldiers had frozen in place, their bodies stiff with indecision as they waited for an order that wasn't coming. She evaluated the angles quickly, but felt a flicker of hesitation when calculating the distance, acknowledging silently that reaching both before the next barrage would be impossible. Instead, she chose the one she could realistically save. She signaled to the closer of the two, a corporal whose face had gone ghost pale beneath the dust, and pointed to a low section of the vehicle's undercarriage, giving him a simple, clear instruction. "Move on the next lull. Hands and knees only. Don't lift your head for any reason." His throat bobbed in a quick swallow, but he nodded with just enough conviction to suggest he might actually follow through. The medic waited for the rhythm she'd memorized, listening for the fractional delay between volleys, then gave a sharp gesture that launched him into a desperate crawl across the sand. He reached the wheel well with only seconds to spare, before another volley hammered the ground behind him, sending up a burst of grit that rained across his boots. The second soldier remained pinned in place, unable to move, but the medic accepted the limitation without frustration, knowing realism mattered more than reckless heroism. She shifted to the kneeling soldier beside her, the one who had noticed her composure earlier, and spoke with the calm urgency of someone building structure out of fragments. "Cover the left sector with controlled bursts. Don't chase shadows or waste ammunition. Keep your muzzle disciplined." His nod was sharper this time, grounded by the trust she had earned through clarity rather than rank. The sergeant glanced toward her, face strained beneath his helmet, and for the first time seemed aware that his commands were scattering rather than gathering his squad. When he shouted again, his voice cracked mid-sentence, leaving the last word hanging in the air like an unfinished plea. Two soldiers looked back at him, then at the medic, unsure which direction would keep them alive. The medic wasn't trying to take command, yet her steadiness filled the vacuum left by the sergeant's unraveling confidence. She crawled to another soldier one, pressed tightly behind a supply crate with trembling fingers, and repositioned his hands on the rifle, helping him find a grip that would prevent accidental discharge. "You're not out," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the crack of another round striking metal. "You're just scared. That's normal. Hold here and wait for my tap." "Oh." She kept her movements small and deliberate, refusing to stretch herself too thin, guiding only the soldiers within reach, while trusting the ones who witnessed her composure to align themselves without being directly ordered. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the panic began to contract. Breathing steadied, movements sharpened, eyes focused on angles rather than fear. Another burst sliced across the range, but instead of collapsing into chaos, the immediate group around her adjusted positions with measured instinct, creating the faint outline of a functional response. The medic tracked their reactions closely, ensuring her influence remained practical rather than overextended. Understanding that control in combat wasn't seized in broad strokes but earned in tight, focused exchanges. The sergeant finally turned toward her, the weight of his failure visible in the slump of his shoulders, and spoke in a hoarse, unsteady voice that carried more humility than command. "What do you see, medic? What's the next move?" It wasn't surrender so much as recognition, an acknowledgement that she had insight he lacked in this moment. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she checked the ridge, measured the interval between shots, and adjusted her stance to prepare for the next shift in momentum. Only then did she answer, her voice low but unwavering, shaped by clarity rather than ego. "I see a way to pull us out of the kill zone," she said, "but you'll need to trust me." And in the middle of the shattered formation, with dust swirling like smoke around their boots, trust was the only command that still held power. The medic lowered her weight into the sand, letting the chaotic rhythm of incoming fire settle into a pattern she could track, because surviving an ambush depended not on heroics, but on reading the battlefield half a second faster than the people trying to kill you. She listened closely to the spread between impacts along the ridge, noting how the firers adjusted elevation after each burst, their discipline suggesting experience rather than the reckless spraying typical of raiders or untrained militias. Beside her, the sergeant steadied his breathing, watching her with an expression caught between embarrassment and relief, recognizing that she had already parsed the terrain's geometry while he had struggled simply to regain control of his voice. She didn't fault him for it. Ambushes shattered plans, training, and ego with extraordinary efficiency, yet she kept her focus on the ridge with a quiet intensity that made it clear the window to reposition was rapidly closing. She pointed toward a shallow depression carved by old vehicle tracks, barely visible beneath drifting grit, and outlined the only viable path, with a calm certainty that left little room for debate. "We move the line through there," she said, her voice low but firm. "It cuts their angle and drops our silhouettes. 2 at a time, only in the lull." The sergeant hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough to show he recognized the risk, before nodding with the resigned understanding of a man willing to yield control to someone who clearly saw the battlefield more clearly than he did. The medic shifted toward the nearest soldier, a private whose hands shook despite his tight grip on the rifle, and placed a steady palm on his forearm to anchor him. "On my shoulder tap, you crawl the track line," she said, keeping her tone measured but direct. "Eyes ahead, body low. Don't check behind you. Trust the timing." He swallowed hard, the fear still present but no longer overwhelming, and braced himself against the sand with a determined exhale. A heavy burst hammered the IFV's side armor, releasing a spray of sparks and dust that rattled across their gear, and the medic waited for the predictable pause that followed the ridge's largest volleys. A narrow breath of silence that experienced shooters used to conserve heat and reset sightlines. When the lull slid open, she tapped the private's shoulder and watched him push forward, his elbows carving channels through the sand as he crawled low and fast toward the depression. He reached it just as the ridge erupted again, rounds chewing fresh scars into the ground behind him, but he remained untouched thanks to the timing she had measured down to instinct rather than calculation. The medic didn't allow herself satisfaction, knowing that one success only proved feasibility, not safety, and turned immediately to the next soldier, adjusting the instructions slightly based on his orientation and the shifting angles of enemy fire. She moved the next pair with similar precision, though not without a flicker of hesitation each time she considered whether she could reach someone farther out of position without exposing herself unnecessarily. Realistically, she knew she couldn't save everyone at once, and the acceptance wasn't cold, it was disciplined, shaped by experience rather than detachment. She focused on those close enough to influence directly, trusting the ripple of her calmness to reach others indirectly. The sergeant repeated her orders to soldiers farther down the line, regaining fragments of authority as he mirrored her clarity, and the squad slowly transformed from a scattering of panicked bodies into a sequence of controlled movements that maintained enough cohesion to stay alive. The medic didn't try to replace him. Instead, she stabilized the section around her, creating a nucleus of composure that others instinctively gravitated toward. When it came time for her own movement, she adjusted the straps of her medical pack, pulling it tight against her spine to prevent snagging, then pulled in a slow, steadying breath that quieted the slight tremor running through her ribs. She signaled to the kneeling soldier, now steady and focused, to provide controlled covering fire. "Short bursts only," she instructed. "Break their cadence, don't try to overpower it." "And 4. He nodded sharply, his confidence reinforced not by bravado but by the clarity she had given him. She counted the interval between shots, reading the cadence like a metronome carved into the desert air, then slid forward in a low, angled crawl that kept her silhouette nearly flush with the ground. The pair beside her moved with equal caution, their breathing loud but controlled, as they followed her through the track line. A round snapped overhead, slicing a heated whisper through the air, and she froze instantly, raising one hand just high enough for the others to see without lifting her head. The lull returned like a brief mercy, and she guided them the final distance into the depression before dropping behind its cover with a controlled exhale that released tension but not focus. She checked the soldiers quickly, verifying they were uninjured and still functional, then lifted her rifle just enough to reassess the ridge, noting how the enemy's firing pattern shifted in response to their repositioning. The squad now formed a rough defensive line along the depression, scattered but protected, breathing hard yet regaining coherence as they realized the kill zone had been broken. Soldiers who had been paralyzed minutes earlier now braced their rifles with steadier hands, glancing toward the medic not with disbelief but with a recognition that bordered on gratitude. For the first time since the ambush began, she raised her own rifle to her shoulder, adjusting the stock with movements that were subtle but unmistakably practiced, revealing a muscle memory the squad had never seen from someone carrying a medic's insignia. The kneeling soldier stared with quiet awe, recognizing the posture as something belonging not to a support specialist, but to someone who had once lived inside the geometry of combat. The sergeant saw it too, and with a slow, steady inhale, accepted what the field itself had already made clear. And as the next ripple of muzzle flash sparked faintly along the ridge, the medic's voice carried across the depression with calm authority, marking the beginning of their counterattack. "On my mark," she said, locking her sights. "We take back the field." The medic settled her cheek against the rifle stock, letting the familiar weight press a steady line from her shoulder to her breath, yet she hesitated for a fraction of a second as a thin tremor of doubt flickered through her muscles, an honest recognition that returning fire meant crossing the line between defense and intent. She exhaled slowly, tightening her grip to quiet the memory rather than erase it, because hesitation was not weakness. It was the precise moment when training took control and fear surrendered to clarity. Around her, soldiers crouched low in the shallow depression, their bodies tense but no longer frozen, watching her with a mixture of hope and worry as they realized she was preparing to fire a shot, none of them expected from someone wearing a medic's insignia. One young private, still rattled by the ambush, mistakenly lifted his rifle too high while adjusting his sight picture, drawing a sharp hiss from the sergeant as a stray round fired upward, with an uncontrolled snap that ricocheted harmlessly off a distant rock. The medic reacted instantly, reaching over to press the private's shoulder downward with calm firmness, anchoring him before panic could spiral again. "Slow down," she murmured, her tone patient but unwavering. "Your weapon follows your breath, not your fear. Keep your muzzle below the crest." The soldier nodded shakily, grounding himself with a controlled inhale, and corrected his posture with a gratitude that carried more weight than words. The sergeant, now kneeling several feet away, observed the medic with renewed clarity, finally understanding that her authority was born not from rank, but from the rare steadiness of someone who never raised her voice, because she had long ago learned to master her pulse. He didn't speak, unwilling to interrupt the fragile focus forming around her, and instead prepared the troops around him to mirror her pacing rather than his earlier, shaken commands. The medic returned her gaze to the ridge, studying the heat distortion where earlier muzzle flashes had briefly revealed their angles, observing how the shimmer bent unevenly in a spot that betrayed the presence of a half-exposed firing position. She adjusted her aim by only a hair's width, feeling the subtle tension of the trigger under her finger, then exhaled again, this time with the steadiness of a decision fully accepted rather than merely attempted. She fired a single, disciplined shot. The crack tore across the range with a sharp finality that startled half the squad, not because of its volume, but because the medic's shot struck the ridgeline with unnerving precision, forcing a figure to jerk out of sight behind scattered rock. A moment of stunned silence followed, as the soldiers processed what they had witnessed, their eyes shifting from the ridge back to her in disbelief that bordered on awe. The enemy hesitated as well, their return fire momentarily stuttering into scattered, confused bursts that lacked the earlier discipline, and the medic used the disruption to signal the kneeling soldier into a new firing angle she had already assessed. "Left notch, 1 inch below the crest," she whispered, her voice steady. "Don't fire until you hear their burst settle." He adjusted his stance with surprising composure, aligning his breathing with the rhythm she had drilled into him through action rather than instruction, and waited for the lull she predicted. When the ridge flickered again, he squeezed off a controlled, 3-round burst that clipped the rock face close enough to force another shooter to relocate, breaking the attacker's firing cadence for the second time in under a minute. Not every soldier succeeded so cleanly. One farther down the line flinched at the echo of his own shot and dropped his magazine into the sand, cursing softly as he fumbled to retrieve it with trembling hands. The medic didn't shame him. Instead, she gestured to the sergeant, who crawled over and helped the soldier reseat the magazine with a calmness that reflected the medic's influence more than his own training. As the squad regained fragments of confidence, the medic lifted her rifle once more, narrowing her eyes toward a faint distortion on the far right of the ridge that hinted at a new firing angle. She read the wind shift through the drifting dust, adjusted her sight picture a fraction lower than her first shot, and squeezed the trigger with deliberate patience. The enemy hesitated as well, their return fire momentarily stuttering into scattered, confused bursts that lacked the earlier discipline, and the medic used the disruption to signal the kneeling soldier into a new firing angle she had already assessed. "Left notch, 1 inch below the crest," she whispered, her voice steady. "Don't fire until you hear their burst settle." "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, not accusingly but with the humbled tone of someone witnessing a skill he couldn't place. She kept her eyes locked on the ridge. "Not here," she answered simply, offering him nothing more than truth wrapped in restraint. The impact snapped a plume of grit from the rock, and the absence of an immediate counterburst confirmed she had disrupted the enemy's second position. She didn't permit satisfaction to slip into her posture. She simply rechecked her angles, maintaining the same quiet focus that had carried her through years of training she rarely spoke about. The sergeant inched closer, speaking in a voice that no longer faltered. She kept her body angled low, breath steady, eyes unblinking, reading the terrain with a precision that made the squad collectively inhale with newfound hope. Because for the first time since the ambush began, the ridge was no longer dictating the terms of the fight, and the medic had no intention of surrendering that advantage. The medic kept her cheek pressed against the rifle stock, letting her breathing settle into a slow, deliberate cadence, though a faint tension still tightened the muscles beneath her ribs, reminding her that even trained calm required maintenance in the heat of a fight. She scanned the ridge again, following the shimmer lines rising from sun-baked rock, while allowing her pulse to fall back into the measured rhythm she trusted more than any conscious thought. Because clarity on a battlefield never arrived as a gift, it had to be carved from noise, wind, and uncertainty. Around her, the squad moved with a cohesion that had not existed minutes earlier, adjusting their angles and settling into firing lanes that reflected her pacing rather than their previous panic. The sergeant crawled along the depression, repositioning two riflemen with quiet hand signals that aligned their arcs with the medic's movements, and although he remained in command by rank, he now let her silence shape the squad's rhythm, the way wind shapes drifting sand gradually but undeniably. The medic lifted her head a fraction, watching a thin plume of dust spiral upward in a direction opposite the prevailing breeze, and recognized the subtle turbulence created by someone shifting behind narrow stone cover. She adjusted her sight picture by a few degrees, but paused as a stronger gust rolled across the range, tugging the crosshair off its intended point, forcing her to relax her trigger finger rather than commit to a shot corrupted by wind she couldn't trust. This recalibration, small, deliberate, entirely necessary, kept her grounded in the disciplined humility she had learned through countless repetitions far away from this range. She shifted her elbow deeper into the sand, anchoring her stance, then reevaluated the shimmer as it drifted across the ridge with renewed clarity, separating natural distortion from movement that didn't belong to the landscape. A soldier to her right whispered, "Do you have something?" in a voice full of both hope and fear. But she didn't answer, choosing instead to track the faint metallic clink that echoed through the shifting breeze, too sharp for falling rock, too light for shell casing, and unmistakably the sound of a weapon brushing against stone. She braced her shoulders, read the dust pulses near the sound, and waited for the shooter to repeat the motion she knew would follow. The next muzzle flash appeared only for a heartbeat, but it was enough to give her the angle she needed. She inhaled slowly, exhaled halfway, then steadied the rifle with practiced control, only for another sudden gust to cut across the depression, forcing her to halt her shot again. As the wind bent her aim slightly to the right, she let out a quiet breath, neither frustrated nor shaken, but aware that patience remained her greatest advantage against shooters who fired quickly but adjusted poorly. She corrected the angle once more, lowering the muzzle 2 inches to compensate for the new drift, and finally squeezed the trigger with a soft firmness that released tension rather than force. Her shot cracked through the air and struck the ridgeline with a sharp burst of grit, sending the enemy shooter slipping back into cover, disrupting the clean firing lane they had used to pressure the squad since the ambush began. A ripple of relief passed through the soldiers crouched nearby, though one private, emboldened too quickly, rose a bit too high in the depression and fired prematurely, his rounds scattering harmlessly across the sand. The medic reached out and pulled his shoulder down with controlled urgency, grounding him without scolding. "Stay low," she murmured, stabilizing his posture. "Let the terrain work for you, not against you." He nodded, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but his breathing eased again as he regained his focus. The sergeant observed this interaction with a mixture of admiration and humility, recognizing the subtle skill in how she corrected mistakes without unraveling the fragile confidence the soldiers had only recently rebuilt. He glanced toward the ridge, then back at her, realizing that her calm precision was not luck or adrenaline, but the worn-in discipline of someone who had been here before, in places far more unforgiving than this training ground turned battlefield. The medic shifted again, this time feeling the depression's floor sloping unevenly beneath her knee, forcing her to reposition slightly to avoid exposing too much of her silhouette. The adjustment cost her a few seconds, but those seconds kept her alive, and she used them to study the way sunlight glinted off a distant piece of metal, small, rhythmic, and too steady to be anything but the edge of a weapon sight, reflecting through heat distortion. She counted the beats between each glint, estimating the shooter's distance by measuring the delay between the shimmer and the dust drift around the ridge's overhang, then angled her rifle higher than before to compensate for elevation she had previously underestimated by a narrow but important margin. Her breath softened into a controlled exhale, and she fired again, her round striking with enough force to collapse the firing lane the enemy had attempted to reopen. The ridge's response came slower this time, their return fire staggered and uncertain, revealing the subtle shift in battlefield dominance that the medic's measured shots had engineered one quiet decision at a time. Soldiers around her exchanged glances heavy with realization, understanding now that her silence hid more than humility. It hid experience that none of them possessed and all of them desperately needed. The sergeant crawled closer, keeping his profile low, and asked in a low voice, "What's their next move?" Not as a superior seeking a report, but as a soldier seeking truth from someone who clearly understood the battlefield's language better than he did. The medic didn't look at him. She tracked the ridge with quiet precision, reading patterns invisible to those who had never learned to survive, by noticing the smallest shifts in dust, shimmer, and sound. "They're relocating," she murmured, calm and certain. "And they're not doing it fast enough." Every soldier near her felt the quiet conviction behind the words, and for the first time since the ambush began, the squad no longer feared the ridge. They feared what she might do to it next. The medic lowered her rifle and scanned the ridge again, watching how the attackers' hesitation stretched into longer, uneven pauses that revealed uncertainty rather than intent, signaling that the moment to transition from survival to controlled advance had finally arrived. She inhaled slowly, feeling the grit settle along the inside of her teeth, then exhaled through steady breath as she studied the strip of broken ground ahead, a modest rise that offered just enough defilade for a crawl if they moved with timing as precise as their last exchange. The sergeant leaned closer, careful not to shift sand or silhouette, recognizing the sharpened concentration in her eyes and understanding that his role now was to support her instincts rather than override them. She extended 2 fingers toward the rise, keeping the gesture tight to the ground, and spoke softly enough that the wind nearly carried her words away. "That's our next hold," she said, quiet but certain. "If we reach it, we break their line of sight by half." 2 soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, noting the open stretch they needed to cross, but the medic remained still, watching the ridge in silence and waiting for the firing pattern to betray the shooter's next lapse. She tracked each scattered burst, noting how one lane fired too quickly, another too slowly, creating a rhythm with small fractures she could slip through if she timed each movement to match those inconsistencies. The first lull surfaced, brief but adequate, and she tapped the nearest soldier's shoulder with firm restraint, pushing him forward into a crawl that smeared dust across his sleeves. To keep the ridge's shooters pinned, she fired a precise shot that forced one rifleman to drop behind the rock lip, giving the soldier just enough time to reach the rise before rounds began punching trenches into the sand behind him. He dropped into cover with a rough exhale, shaken but safe. The second soldier prepared to move, but a sudden gust pushed a dense cloud of grit into the air, distorting her view and blurring the shimmer she relied on for distant cues. She lifted her finger in a silent halt, refusing to gamble on obstructed information, and the soldier froze instantly, his breath trapped in his chest as he waited for her call. When the haze thinned enough for her to regain a clean read on the ridge, she nodded once, and he lunged forward with renewed focus, sliding behind the rise as incoming rounds cracked dangerously close overhead. The sergeant observed the exchange with growing respect, understanding that her reluctance to move through uncertainty was not fear but discipline, the kind forged through experience rather than instruction. He crawled to her side again and asked quietly, "How many more can we push before they reset?" She kept her eyes fixed on the ridge. 2, maybe 3, she murmured. "But the third will cost us a heartbeat. They're starting to regroup." Play. She repositioned her elbows into a firmer patch of packed sand, anchoring herself for the next cover shot. But as she aimed, the ground beneath her left knee shifted slightly, collapsing a shallow pocket that threw off her alignment by just enough to send her first corrective shot half an inch too high. The round clipped a harmless piece of rock, and she clenched her jaw in frustration, not shame, just precision demanding correction, then recalibrated her sight picture to compensate for the depression's uneven depth. The next soldier moved as she fired her corrected shot, the round hitting close enough to force an enemy shooter down for cover, creating the shallow but crucial gap he needed to sprint crawl across the sand. He reached the rise but stumbled on a ridge of packed grit, falling harder than intended before scrambling into safety with a muffled gasp. The medic tracked the ridge immediately, checking if the stumble drew enemy attention, then exhaled softly when the shooters failed to capitalize. Only one soldier remained. He was young, breathing too quickly and pressing his helmet too low, as if hiding could stop the panic rippling through his chest. The medic placed her hand on the back of his shoulder plate, grounding him with controlled calm that bridged instinct and empathy. "You're moving next," she said quietly. "Not because you feel ready, because I'm here to cover you when it breaks bad." He nodded with trembling resolve, body coiled low as he edged forward to the lip of the depression. She read the ridge with renewed intensity, tracking how one firing lane had gone silent, a sign someone was either relocating or overthinking, and waited for that brief, critical gap to open again. She tapped his shoulder. He pushed forward, but halfway across the sand, an enemy rifleman re-emerged faster than she anticipated, lighting up the ground around him with a sudden, disciplined burst. The soldier faltered, instinctively collapsing into a crouch that threatened to leave him exposed for too long. The medic reacted instantly, shifting her rifle to a razor-thin angle and firing a shot so tight it shaved a line through the ridge's edge, forcing the shooter to wrench back behind cover in reflex rather than strategy. The soldier scrambled the remaining distance into safety, chest heaving with adrenaline, and slumped behind the rise with a whispered thank you that dissolved into the wind. The medic rolled her shoulders once, letting tension release through controlled breath, and the sergeant saw the faint flicker of strain pass through her expression before she steadied herself again. She crawled forward to join the squad at the rise, checking each soldier with quick glances before lifting her rifle to study the ridge from the new perspective. The attackers' firing pattern was thinner now, their timing fractured and their angles compromised by the squad's crawl and shift advance. From this position, she could see how the enemy had funneled themselves into a narrower segment of the ridge, creating a choke point perfect for a controlled push. She narrowed her eyes, raised her rifle, and let her breath settle before she spoke again, quiet, steady, and fully in command. "We're close enough to take that ridge," she said. "We push together, move clean, and finish this right." Every soldier, even the shaken ones, nodded, because she hadn't earned their trust with rank or bravado. She earned it through precision, restraint, and sacrifice, one impossible call at a time. The medic pressed her body lower against the rise, letting the squad's breathing settle into a unified rhythm that allowed them to move as a cohesive element, rather than a scattered group still recovering from the opening shock of the ambush. She scanned the ridge again, noting how the attackers had compressed into a tighter firing pocket that narrowed their sightlines more than they realized, creating the kind of structural weakness she had once learned to exploit in places far harsher than this desert training range turned battlefield. Her gaze swept across the mixed terrain ahead until she spotted a narrow run of darker soil carved by steady crosswinds, forming a shallow corridor that could hide their approach if they crawled low enough and kept their movements tightly staggered. The sergeant followed her line of sight, recognizing that she wasn't just locating cover, she was designing a controlled advance sequence, taught not in classrooms, but in the kind of operations that left muscle memory where medals never could. She traced a subtle line in the sand with one finger, whispering, "We shift left, then cut inward," her voice low enough to blend with the wind rather than push against it, trusting the soldiers to lean closer rather than force her to speak louder. The private she had steadied earlier swallowed hard and murmured, "You've done this before, haven't you?" in a tone that held awe rather than suspicion. But she kept her eyes on the ridge, her silence revealing more truth than any answer he might have expected. Without waiting for questions, she slid forward into the shallow corridor, her elbows carving thin lines through the sand as the squad followed at precise intervals that mirrored her pacing. The sand was hot enough to burn through their sleeves, carrying a metallic scent from freshly fractured stone, and the medic embraced the discomfort with an ease that made the sergeant realize she was not improvising. She was returning to something long practiced, something she had once lived rather than learned. A sudden crack of gunfire cut low across the ground, shaving dust into their faces and forcing the squad flat against the sand. The medic froze, listening to the recoil's echo to identify the shooter's perch, noting how the angle came from slightly above the ridge's midpoint, meaning someone had climbed higher in an attempt to regain control of the engagement. She clicked her tongue softly, not in irritation but in recognition that their window to reposition was narrowing faster than preferred. She signaled the sergeant close and whispered, "They're elevating. We need to move before they reset the field." She traced a subtle line in the sand with one finger, whispering, "We shift left, then cut inward," her voice low enough to blend with the wind rather than push against it, trusting the soldiers to lean closer rather than force her to speak louder. Her gaze swept across the mixed terrain ahead until she spotted a narrow run of darker soil carved by steady crosswinds, forming a shallow corridor that could hide their approach if they crawled low enough and kept their movements tightly staggered. The sergeant followed her line of sight, recognizing that she wasn't just locating cover, she was designing a controlled advance sequence, taught not in classrooms, but in the kind of operations that left muscle memory where medals never could. From this vantage, she saw the attackers more clearly, two riflemen shifting into a new angle, one bracing his rifle against a rock lip, while another scanned the valley with nervous overcorrection. The medic's jaw tensed as she recognized the setup. It echoed a formation she had once broken under far darker circumstances, a memory that flickered through her posture but never reached her expression. She slid back to the squad and whispered, "They're bunching on the upper lip. If we flank from the left, we cut their field in seconds." The sergeant inhaled slowly, realizing the opportunity forming through her analysis rather than random luck, and he nodded with a controlled focus that mirrored her composure, rather than his own earlier uncertainty. She lifted her rifle, not to fire, but to mark the exact angle they needed to approach, and her voice held the steady confidence of someone who had built plans like this under fire more times than she wished to count. "We sweep under the overhang, use the rock split for cover, then break their line before they reposition," she said. "Stay low, stay tight, and move exactly when I move." The soldiers nodded with quiet conviction. Their trust, no longer something she earned moment by moment, but something solidified through every impossible call she had made since the ambush began. The medic took one last breath, letting the wind brush across her cheek and carry away the lingering tension, then slid forward into the final stretch that would bring them within striking distance of the ridge. And the squad followed her without hesitation, not because she wore a medic's cross, but because her movements revealed the truth they had begun to understand. She wasn't becoming a leader today. She was remembering how to be one. The medic pressed her palm into the heated sand and let the silence between scattered bursts stretch just long enough for her breathing to fall into the precise, controlled rhythm required for close-quarters ascent, because the final approach to an entrenched firing position punished even the smallest lapse in discipline. She studied the ridge's lower lip again, reading the faint dust tremors drifting beneath the angled rock where the attackers had braced their rifles, mapping their positions not through direct sight but through the subtle signatures only someone trained in harsher places would instinctively recognize. She crawled forward, lowering her profile even further as a gust pushed a wave of hot grit down the slope, momentarily blurring her sightline and forcing her to blink twice to keep her focus sharp. The squad mirrored her with disciplined caution, each soldier following her pacing rather than their own instinct, recognizing that one misread elbow or misjudged breath could expose the entire approach. The sergeant stayed tight on her left flank, matching her rhythm with a steadiness that revealed how much faith he had shifted onto her quiet authority. They reached the stretch where the incline steepened abruptly, forming a natural blind spot that offered cover only if they hugged the sand tightly enough to avoid dislodging loose gravel. She halted and raised 2 fingers before flattening them again, signaling the squad to freeze while she listened to the faint scrape of shifting stone above an attacker, adjusting position and unknowingly revealing the urgency of their own uncertainty. She waited, counting through the dull thump of her heartbeat until the ridge quieted, then resumed the climb with deliberate slowness. The angled crawl forced her to brace her weight on narrow pockets of compacted sand, distributing pressure carefully to prevent sliding debris from giving away their presence. Her movements carried a practiced efficiency that surprised even her, a muscle memory returning with disconcerting clarity. As if the terrain had unlocked reflexes she had spent years burying beneath medical protocol and quiet humility. The sergeant saw that same sharpened ease in her posture and realized the truth he hadn't wanted to assume. She wasn't discovering this under fire. She was reverting to something deeply ingrained. Halfway up the slope, a sudden burst cracked across the ridge, spraying stone fragments that skidded down the incline like small, burning insects. The medic flattened immediately, shielding her face as a shard struck her shoulder plate with a sharp sting, but she kept her breathing steady, waiting for the follow-up flash that would reveal the shooter's angle. When it came, she tracked the recoil signature rather than the muzzle, a technique far beyond the typical experience of combat medics, and her instincts aligned with an old steadiness that surfaced faster than she could suppress. She signaled left, guiding the squad toward a narrow rock split where they could brace for the final ascent without clustering, and the soldiers followed without hesitation, their trust reinforced through the calm accuracy of each decision she made under pressure. The young private nearly mirrored her hand placement as he crawled behind her, copying her technique with the trembling precision of someone convinced that survival depended on imitating her movements exactly. When she reached the split, she slid into it with practiced grace, bracing both boots against the incline for leverage. From here, the attackers' breaths became faintly audible, uneven, tense, and uncomfortably close. Hearing them triggered a flicker of memory she hadn't summoned willingly in years. A night in a different landscape, with different stakes, when breaths this close had meant the difference between life and silence. The memory flashed through her muscles rather than her thoughts, tightening her grip before she forced herself to release just enough tension to stay measured. She angled her rifle up, realizing the overhang forced her to cant the stock inward and aggressively tilt the muzzle to maintain a clean line of fire without exposing her helmet's crown. She checked the angle twice, resisting a familiar instinct to push forward too quickly, a reflex born from another life, one she had left behind, and allowed herself that tiny pause to reassert control. Only then did she steady the weapon, aligning the barrel with a narrow slice of sky just beneath the rock lip. A faint scuff of boot rubber scraped against stone above small, fast, and unmistakably the sound of a shooter adjusting foot placement to sweep his aim downward. She snapped her rifle a hair left and fired a precise round into the rock edge with just enough force to explode grit upward, startling the shooter and forcing him deeper behind cover before he could angle down on the squad. The troops froze, stunned not by the shot itself, but by how she had read the movement before they perceived the threat. "Move now," she whispered, voice low but absolute. The squad pressed upward behind her, bodies blending into the rock as they advanced through the split and onto the final shelf beneath the ridge's crown. The medic paused, listening again not for sound, but for the subtle cadence of movement above, a rhythm she understood at a depth that unsettled even her. Not because she was growing into something new, but because she was remembering something she had spent years deliberately forgetting. She raised her hand once more, signaling the final push, and the squad followed her, because in the tension of that climb, they understood she did not just know how to survive this approach. She had survived too many like it before. The medic braced her hand against the sun-baked stone beneath the ridge's crown, letting the heat soak through her gloves as she prepared for the controlled breach that would carry them from concealment into immediate contact with the shooters above. She listened carefully to the faint metallic cues, drifting down the subtle tap of a magazine being reseated, the tightening of a sling, and the restless scrape of boots trying to find traction on uneven rock, all of which formed a clearer picture of an enemy, uneasy with the silence they no longer understood. She inhaled once, deep and slow, grounding her nerves with the same disciplined breath she had relied on years earlier in places far more unforgiving than this ridge. The squad closed in behind her, their movements guided more by her quiet confidence than any formal training, each soldier flattening further into the rock's natural shadow as the incline steepened toward the crown. The sergeant matched her posture with careful precision, silently acknowledging that whatever she was about to do, she had done countless times before. She raised her fist, held it long enough for the squad's breathing to synchronize, then spread her fingers in a deliberate motion that signaled a controlled advance to the final step beneath the ridge lip. But instead of cresting immediately, she slid her body several inches right, letting her palm hover over the rock to feel the airflow curling around the edge, an old habit used to sense barrel direction or movement above without exposing a silhouette. The sergeant recognized the motion instantly, realizing he was watching not a medic improvising, but a veteran returning to the instincts she had worked hard to bury. The medic rose just enough to bring her eyes level with the ridge's underside, but before she surfaced fully, a cluster of small pebbles scattered downward as one attacker stepped too close to the edge. She reacted instantly, angling her torso away from the falling grit while planting her boot against a firm crack in the rock and pulling herself upward with a practiced, silent movement that placed her directly beneath the shooter's blind side. She lifted her rifle, canting the stock inward to stabilize her aim on the uneven surface, and fired a precise burst that struck the stone inches from the man's ankle, forcing him backward with a startled grunt as his weapon jerked upward. He didn't fall back immediately. He panicked first, firing a wild, blind shot that snapped over her head and ricocheted down the slope in a sharp whine. She had already anticipated the reaction, shifting her weight lower to avoid the reckless counterfire before sliding into the opening he left behind, her movements fluid with the kind of experience no medic training could provide. The squad followed closely, emerging onto the ridge in staggered positions that branched out into a controlled semicircle at her direction. Her voice stayed low, steady, and unmistakably authoritative as she gave rapid instructions that aligned perfectly with the terrain's flow. Left arc, adjust half a body width, anchor on the overhang, Keep your barrels leveled to the lip." The soldiers obeyed instantly, recognizing that each phrase carried the weight of lived experience, not borrowed doctrine. A muzzle flash erupted from the far right before they fully stabilized, pushing one soldier into a frantic dive behind a jagged outcrop. Instead of firing reflexively, the medic tracked the dust signature trailing behind the shooter's recoil and adjusted downward by several inches to anticipate his next shot. Her counterburst hit the rock beside him with punishing precision, forcing him into a desperate scuttle that exposed his flank long enough for the sergeant to sweep forward and secure the angle with controlled aggression. They moved deeper across the ridge together, their motions synchronized through the medic's pacing rather than spoken commands. She dropped into a low, balanced crouch as another attacker rose from behind a rock lip, predicting the man's positioning before he had fully exposed himself. Her shot clipped his weapon and sent it skidding across the ridge, forcing him into a retreat. She cut short by shifting her aim to block his escape path, rather than firing a lethal follow-up, an intentional restraint that flickered across her posture with the weight of someone who had once been trained to eliminate threats, not merely neutralize them. The squad exchanged glances filled with dawning comprehension, because every movement she made confirmed that her past was not rumor or exaggeration, but something carved into instinct, breath, and bone. And when the final attacker attempted to sprint toward the ridge's far lip, moving low and fast along uneven stone, the medic pivoted on her heel with a smoothness that spoke of countless repetitions, firing a tight burst that forced him into open ground, where the sergeant closed the distance with a decisive tackle that ended the fight entirely. Silence dropped heavy across the ridge, settling like heat soaked into metal at midday. The medic lowered her rifle slowly, exhaling a long, quiet breath that carried both relief and a lingering tension she could not fully shake. She looked over the ridge, not as someone proud of victory, but as someone who had once stood in too many places just like this and knew how easily a different outcome could have unfolded. The sergeant approached her with careful respect, reading the weight in her posture, and spoke softly not as a commander demanding answers, but as a soldier recognizing truth. "This wasn't new for you," he murmured. "This was familiar." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The ridge, the silence, and the squad's eyes said everything her voice refused to admit. The medic stood quietly near the ridge's shattered edge, letting the fading heat drift across the stone and wash away the last thin traces of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Her posture steady, yet softened by the deep, controlled breath she finally allowed herself after the adrenaline had begun to fade. The squad formed a semicircle around her, unplanned, unscripted, and absent of any formal command drawn, not by ceremony, but by an instinctive understanding that the person who had pulled them through the chaos deserved a rare moment untouched by noise, questions, or expectation. The wind pushed gently across the ridge, carrying dust through fractured stone and settling into a low hum that blended with the soldiers' breathing, grounding them in the simple reality that they were alive because she had stepped into a role none of them knew she carried. The sergeant approached her first, adjusting his rifle with a subtle click as he searched for a gesture that expressed respect without breaking the quiet dignity of the moment, then settled for a nod that held more sincerity than any scripted commendation he could have spoken aloud. He studied her with a mixture of gratitude and sober recognition, understanding at last that her precision came from more than training, and he lowered his voice to a tone meant only for her. "Whatever you did before this," he murmured, "it prepared you for today in ways the rest of us can't even name." She held his gaze briefly, her eyes steady, but marked by a depth he recognized as experience earned under circumstances she would never willingly describe, then looked away with a small exhale that carried the weight of years she had chosen not to share. The squad watched in respectful silence, waiting for any fragment of explanation, but she offered none, choosing instead to kneel beside a fallen pack and begin checking their wounded with the deliberate, grounded motions of someone who placed duty above memory and purpose above pride. Her silence wasn't evasive or cold, it was protective, shielding a history she had buried beneath the medic's insignia she wore, not as a mask but as a promise to herself that she would save more lives than she ever took. The sergeant recognized the boundary, stepping back with a quiet nod that acknowledged her right to hold some truths close. One by one, the soldiers approached with small, wordless gestures of gratitude, a canteen placed near her knee, a strap tightened on her pack, or a simple tap against her shoulder plate, each action carrying an unspoken respect that didn't depend on knowing her past, but on witnessing who she became when the ridge demanded more than anyone else could give. Leadership, they realized, didn't always come with rank, and courage didn't always arrive wearing authority. Sometimes it came from the quiet figure no one expected to step forward, until stepping forward became the only way to keep the team alive. Before leaving the ridge, the sergeant performed a final sweep along the crest, checking angles and scanning the horizon while the squad reset their safeties and confirmed clear sectors, a routine end-of-contact ritual that felt heavier today, shaped by the understanding that they were not simply walking away from a firefight, but from a moment that had revealed truths none of them had been ready to see. The medic joined them only when she had finished tending to every injury, brushing dust from her sleeves with a small, almost unconscious motion, as if grounding herself again in the role she chose, rather than the one she had been forced to reveal. As they started their descent, she paused for a heartbeat, letting her gaze sweep across the open expanse below, her expression softening with a flicker of emotion so brief, the squad barely caught it, a look that carried equal parts relief and the quiet, private ache of remembering what she had spent years suppressing. She adjusted her pack, rolled her shoulders once, and returned to formation with calm steps, reclaiming the understated place she held before the ambush had stripped away her anonymity. The sergeant fell in beside her as the group moved down the slope, keeping his voice low enough to remain theirs alone. "Whatever you were before," he said quietly, "I'm grateful you're here now." She didn't speak, but the slight, steadying breath she took was an answer in itself, unadorned, unspoken, and deeply honest. And as the sun dipped behind the rocks, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand, the squad followed her with a respect, forged not from legend or rank, but from truth earned under fire, the truth that courage, dignity, and compassion endure long after uniforms fade, and the strongest warriors are often the ones who never ask to be seen at all.